Hello everyone! If you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
My mother-in-law's first lesson. What if the woman you thought would judge your English became the person who quietly changed your life? I still remember the morning my American mother-in-law looked at me across the kitchen table and said, "You don't need better English. You need more patience." I thought she was criticizing me. I was wrong. That one sentence would lead to a painful misunderstanding, a surprising lesson about marriage and family, and a moment when I almost stopped speaking English altogether. But first, you need to understand why those simple words hurt me so much. I was standing in our kitchen in the United States, making coffee while my husband prepared breakfast for our children. It was an ordinary American morning. The kids were arguing about cereal. My husband was looking for his keys. The dog was staring at me as if breakfast was legally overdue. Everything was normal. Except me. I was tired of making mistakes in English. I could understand many conversations, but sometimes people spoke too quickly. Sometimes I knew the words when I read them, but when someone said them, my brain suddenly went on vacation. Very convenient. Very rude. And sometimes I wanted to answer my husband or speak with my children, but the sentence disappeared before I could say it. I began to feel embarrassed. Then my mother-in-law walked into the kitchen. She was an American woman with a calm voice, sharp eyes, and an unbelievable talent for noticing everything. She looked at me and asked, "How was your morning?" I answered too quickly. She asked me to repeat it. I repeated it. Then I made a small mistake. She corrected me gently. I smiled, but inside, I felt that familiar pressure. I did not want another correction. I wanted to speak without thinking about every word. My mother-in-law sat down beside me. She did not open a textbook. She did not give me a grammar lesson. Instead, she pointed at my coffee and said, "Tell me about it." I laughed. "It's coffee." She smiled. "I know. Tell me more." So I tried. Slowly, I described the coffee, the morning, the children, and my plans for the day. She listened. When I made mistakes, she waited. That surprised me. Most people wait for their turn to speak. She seemed to wait for me to finish. Then she said something that I did not understand emotionally, even though I understood every English word. Patience is part of love. I stared at her. What does that mean? She looked toward my husband and the children. It means people need time. Your children need time. Your husband needs time. You need time. I need time. I wanted to agree, but another part of me felt defensive. Why was she talking about patience? Was she saying I was impatient? Was she saying I was not good enough for her son? My mind started building a courtroom, and apparently I was both the lawyer and the defendant. I became quiet. She noticed. Of course she noticed. Then she leaned closer and said, "I am not telling you to become someone else. I am telling you to stop being afraid of mistakes." That sentence hit me harder than I expected. Because she was right. I had been treating every English mistake like evidence against me. One wrong word felt like failure. One missed sentence felt like proof that I was not improving. But learning a language does not work that way. When you listen repeatedly, read aloud, and use simple phrases in meaningful situations, your brain gets more opportunities to connect sounds with meaning. You do not need to understand everything at once. You need enough patience to keep going. My mother-in-law picked up her coffee and said, "Let's practice one sentence." She looked at me and asked, "What do you want to say to your husband today?" I thought for a moment. Then I said, "I need you to listen to me." She smiled. "Good. Now say it slowly." I repeated it. "I need you to listen to me." I had no idea that sentence would become important later that same day. Because that afternoon, my husband and I would have an argument, and my mother-in-law would hear every word. A kitchen, 2 generations. What happens when one simple English sentence means something completely different to the person hearing it? That afternoon, I learned the answer in the most uncomfortable way possible. I had practiced one sentence with my mother-in-law that morning. "I need you to listen to me." I thought it was a useful sentence. I thought it sounded calm. I had no idea that by dinner time, those 8 words would become the center of an argument between my husband and me. It started with something very ordinary. My husband came home from work, dropped his keys on the counter, kissed the children, and asked me how my day was. I wanted to tell him about my English practice. I wanted to tell him about my mother-in-law and the strange little lesson she had given me. Instead, I started talking too quickly. He asked me to repeat myself. I tried again. Then he checked his phone while I was speaking. I stopped. "Are you listening?" I asked. He said, "Yes, of course." Something inside me snapped. "I need you to listen to me." The sentence came out stronger than I intended. My husband looked surprised. "I am listening." "No, you're not." He put his phone down. "Why are you angry?" That question made me even more upset. I was not only angry about the phone. I was angry about all the small moments I had collected during the week. When I could not find the right English word. When someone spoke too quickly. When my children corrected me. When I understood a conversation 5 minutes after it ended. And now my husband was looking at me as if I had suddenly become difficult. I tried to explain, but my English became messy because my emotions were moving faster than my vocabulary. I said something that came out wrong. My husband misunderstood me. I saw his face change. Then he said, "Maybe you're taking this too seriously." Wrong sentence. Wrong moment. My eyes filled with tears. I walked toward the kitchen, and my mother-in-law was there. She had heard us. She did not immediately defend her son. She did not criticize me either. She simply asked, "What happened?" I answered, "Nothing." She raised an eyebrow. American mothers have many talents. Apparently, detecting nothing is one of them. She looked at me and said, "Try again." I took a breath. "I feel ignored." She nodded. "Better." Then she turned to my husband. "And you?" He looked uncomfortable. "I feel attacked." My mother-in-law looked at both of us and said, "Good. Now you are finally talking about feelings instead of fighting about sentences." I almost laughed. Almost. She explained something I had never thought about. When people speak a second language, emotional conversations can become harder because we are searching for words while also managing feelings. That mental pressure can make us speak too fast, forget vocabulary, or misunderstand tone. So she suggested something simple: slow down. One person speaks. The other listens. Then the listener repeats the meaning before answering. It sounded almost too simple. But we tried it. I said, I felt ignored when you looked at your phone. My husband repeated, you felt ignored because I looked at my phone. I nodded. Then he said, I was tired, but I understand why that hurt you. I repeated his meaning. Slowly, the argument changed. We were no longer trying to win. We were trying to understand. My mother-in-law smiled and went back to washing dishes as if she had just repaired a broken engine. That evening, I wrote 3 sentences in my English notebook. I feel ignored. Please listen to me. I need a moment. I read them aloud several times. They were simple sentences, but they gave me something I needed more than advanced vocabulary: control. Later that night, my husband apologized. I apologized too. Then he asked me something unexpected. Why are you so afraid of making English mistakes? I looked at him. I wanted to answer honestly, but before I could, my mother-in-law appeared in the doorway. She had heard his question. She looked at me and said, because someone made her believe mistakes make her less valuable. I froze. I had never told her that. Not once. I looked at my mother-in-law and whispered, how do you know? She did not answer. Instead, she walked to the table, placed an old photograph in front of me, and said, because I know exactly where that fear began. When patience starts running out. What if the person teaching you to speak English was also quietly teaching you how to forgive yourself? I stared at the old photograph on the kitchen table and felt my confidence disappear. I knew the people in the picture. I knew the house. I knew the day. But I did not understand why my mother-in-law had chosen that photograph. She pointed at me and said, look at your face. I looked closer. I was smiling, but my eyes looked nervous. That was the day you tried to tell a story in English, she said. I remembered it immediately. It had happened months earlier at a family dinner in our home in the United States. Everyone was laughing and talking. I wanted to join the conversation, so I told a funny story about something my daughter had done at school. I used the wrong word. Everyone understood what I meant, but one person laughed at my English. It was probably harmless. Maybe they did not mean to hurt me. But I remembered that laugh. I remembered the heat in my face. I remembered suddenly becoming quiet. After that day, I started preparing sentences in my head before speaking. I checked words twice. Sometimes 3 times. By the time I was ready to speak, the conversation had already moved on. My mother-in-law looked at me and said, you stopped taking chances after that day. I wanted to deny it. Instead, I said, maybe. She shook her head. Not maybe. You did. Her honesty surprised me. She was not trying to make me feel better. She was trying to make me see the truth. I told her that English was exhausting sometimes. I could listen to a slow English story and understand almost everything. Then a real conversation would happen, and suddenly people sounded like they were racing downhill on bicycles with no brakes. She laughed. That is real life. I laughed too. Then she said something serious. You think patience means waiting for other people. It also means waiting for yourself. That sentence stayed in my mind. I had been impatient with my English. I wanted quick results. I wanted to speak naturally. I wanted to understand every joke, every expression, every fast sentence. When I failed, I treated the mistake like a personal judgment. My mother-in-law told me that language learning is closer to building a path than passing a test. You walk the same path many times. Some days it feels easy. Other days, you trip over the same stone. That does not mean the path disappeared. It means you are still walking. So she gave me a strange challenge. For 1 week, she said, you are not allowed to apologize for your English. I stared at her. What if I make a mistake? Correct it and continue. What if people laugh? Let them laugh. What if I sound stupid? She smiled. Then sound stupid for 10 seconds and keep speaking. I laughed so hard that my husband came into the kitchen to see what was happening. I explained the challenge. He immediately said, I like your mom's idea. I looked at him. Of course you do. He laughed. The next morning, I began. At breakfast, I said something incorrectly. I stopped myself from saying, sorry, my English is bad. Instead, I corrected the sentence and continued. My daughter noticed. Mom, you didn't apologize. I smiled. I'm practicing. She nodded as if I had announced a new family law. During the week, something strange happened. My English did not suddenly become perfect. But I became less afraid. I listened more carefully. I spoke more slowly. I started using simple phrases without worrying about whether they sounded impressive. Could you repeat that? I'm not sure. Let me think. What do you mean? Those phrases gave me space. And space gave my brain time to work. I began to understand that slow English listening was not about making everything slower forever. It was about giving yourself enough time to notice patterns until natural speed became less frightening. But by Friday, my patience was running out. My husband forgot something important. The children were arguing. I had a difficult conversation at school. Then, at dinner, I made another English mistake and heard a small laugh from across the table. I froze. The old feeling returned instantly. My face became hot. My confidence disappeared. I pushed my chair back and stood up. I'm done, I said. My mother-in-law looked at me. Done with dinner? I shook my head. No. I'm done trying. The room went silent. Then my mother-in-law stood up, walked toward me, and said something that made my heart break. Good. Now I can finally tell you why I never wanted you to speak perfect English. The truth behind her patience. What if your biggest English lesson had nothing to do with English? I thought my mother-in-law was going to tell me that I needed to study harder, speak faster, or memorize more words. Instead, she looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, I never wanted you to speak perfect English. I could not understand. For months, I had believed my mistakes were the problem. I thought my slow answers embarrassed my husband. I thought my children noticed every wrong word. I thought my mother-in-law was quietly waiting for the day I would finally sound like a native speaker. But now she was telling me the opposite. I stood in the kitchen, completely confused. Then why have you been teaching me? I asked. She took a slow breath. Because you were afraid to speak. That answer hurt more than any correction. She explained that she had noticed something long before I noticed it myself. Every time I made a mistake, I looked around the room before continuing. I watched people's faces. I checked whether they were laughing. I was not listening to English anymore. I was listening for judgment. My mother-in-law said, you were trying to protect yourself from embarrassment, but you were also protecting yourself from progress. I sat down. Suddenly, I remembered all those moments when I had stayed quiet at family dinners. My husband would ask, "What do you think?" And I would say, "I don't know." Not because I had no opinion. I had plenty of opinions. I simply did not trust my English enough to express them. That was the real problem. My mother-in-law reached for my hand. "You think patience means I am waiting for your English to improve," she said. "No. Patience means I am giving you room to become confident." I felt tears in my eyes. She told me that when she was younger, she had struggled with something completely different. She had been afraid to speak up at work because she believed every mistake would make people respect her less. She learned that silence can feel safe, but safety can become a cage. "I know that look," she said. "You have the same look." I laughed through my tears. "So we are both afraid of looking stupid?" She smiled. Exactly. That moment changed something between us. I had always seen her as my husband's mother. The woman who had opinions about family dinners, children's clothes, and how I cooked vegetables. Suddenly, I saw her as a woman who had also been afraid, embarrassed, and imperfect. It made her human in a new way. It also changed the way I practiced English. Instead of trying to memorize difficult vocabulary, I started practicing sentences connected to my real life. "I disagree." "I need help." "I don't understand." "Please slow down." "I feel hurt." "I need some time." These sentences were simple, but they were powerful because I actually needed them. My mother-in-law told me that useful English is not always impressive English. Sometimes the strongest sentence is the simplest one. I began listening to slow English stories while making breakfast. I repeated one sentence aloud 3 times. Then I used it during the day. If I heard, "I'm not sure," I practiced saying it naturally. If I heard, "What do you mean?" I used it when I genuinely needed clarification. Little by little, English stopped being a performance. It became communication. But the biggest test came that weekend. My husband and I were invited to a family gathering. I almost refused to go. I knew there would be fast conversations, jokes, and people talking over each other. My old fear returned. My husband noticed and asked, "Do you want to stay home?" I almost said yes. Then my mother-in-law looked at me and quietly said, "Go. You do not need perfect English. You only need your voice." So I went. At first, everything was fine. Then someone asked me a question about my marriage. It was personal. Everyone became quiet. I understood every word. I knew exactly what they were asking. But the answer I gave shocked everyone at the table. My husband looked at me. My mother-in-law stopped smiling. And I suddenly realized I had said something in English that I had never dared to say in our family before. Something honest. Something painful. Something that could change my marriage. The truth, I finally said. What would you say if your entire family were waiting for your answer, and for the first time, you were not afraid of your English? I still remember that dinner in our American home. My mother-in-law sat quietly beside me. My husband looked confused. The children were watching us without understanding why the adults had suddenly become so serious. Someone had asked me a simple question about my marriage. "Do you feel hurt at home?" I understood every word. That was the strange part. My English was not the problem anymore. My courage was. I looked at my husband and took a slow breath. Sometimes, I said, I feel like I am alone even when you are sitting next to me. The room became silent. My husband's face changed. I immediately wanted to take the words back. My old instinct screamed, say something easier. Make a joke. Apologize. But my mother-in-law gently touched my hand under the table. She did not rescue me. She simply stayed there. So I continued. I know you love me. I know you work hard for our family. But sometimes I speak, and you answer before I finish. Sometimes I tell you something important, and you look at your phone. And when my English is slow, I feel like my words are less important. My husband looked down. I expected anger. Instead, he whispered, I didn't know you felt that way. I almost laughed because I had tried to tell him many times. But I had never told him clearly. I had used half sentences. I had changed topics. I had said, it's okay, when it was not okay. My English had become a hiding place. If I could not find the perfect sentence, I could avoid the difficult conversation. That night, I realized something painful. Sometimes we blame a language for a silence that actually comes from fear. My mother-in-law looked at my husband and said, let her finish. He nodded. I continued slowly. I don't need you to fix everything. I need you to listen. Those words were simple. But they were powerful because they were true. My husband put his phone on the table, face down. Okay, he said. I'm listening. I told him about the moments when I felt embarrassed speaking English around his family. I told him about the dinner months earlier when someone laughed at one of my mistakes. I told him that I had started believing every mistake made me look less intelligent. My husband looked shocked. Why didn't you tell me? I answered honestly. Because I was afraid you would think I was weak. He shook his head. I thought you were quiet because you were tired. My mother-in-law suddenly laughed softly. We looked at her. She said, this is why people need patience. We are constantly guessing what other people mean. That sentence became one of my favorite English lessons. When you are learning English, guessing can be dangerous. You hear one word and imagine the meaning. You hear a tone and create a story. You see someone's face and decide they are judging you. But communication becomes easier when you ask. What do you mean? Are you upset with me? Did I understand you correctly? These simple questions can prevent an entire emotional disaster. My mother-in-law taught me to slow down conversations, not because slow English is always better, but because careful listening creates room for truth. That night, my husband apologized. I apologized too. Then he asked me a question that I did not expect. What can I do differently? I thought carefully. When I speak English, please don't finish my sentence. He nodded. Okay. And if I make a mistake, don't correct me unless I ask. He smiled. Okay. Then he asked, anything else? I looked at him. Listen to the whole sentence before you answer. He reached across the table and held my hand. I can do that. The children eventually lost interest in the adult conversation and returned to their food, which was probably the healthiest response anyone had that evening. But something had changed. My husband was not defending himself anymore. I was not hiding anymore. And my mother-in-law was smiling like someone who had been waiting for this exact moment. Later that night, after the children were asleep, I found her alone in the kitchen. I thanked her for helping me. She shook her head. I didn't teach you English, she said. I only helped you stop being afraid of it. Then she opened a drawer and pulled out a small notebook. There is something else you need to know. I looked at the notebook. On the first page was my name, written in her handwriting. Under it were dozens of English sentences. But they were not sentences she had written for me. They were sentences I had said over the past year, sentences I did not remember saying. I turned the page. At the bottom, one sentence was underlined twice. I am afraid my husband will stop loving me if I am not good enough. My heart stopped. I looked at her. When did I say this? She closed the notebook and whispered, "The night your husband almost left the house." The night he almost left. What if the sentence you were most afraid to say was the sentence your marriage needed to hear? I stood in my mother-in-law's kitchen, staring at the little notebook in her hands. One sentence was still burning inside my mind. I am afraid my husband will stop loving me if I am not good enough. I had forgotten saying those words. My mother-in-law had not. And when she finally told me what happened that night, I realized my husband had not almost left because my English was bad. He had almost left because he thought I no longer wanted him. The memory came back slowly. It had happened months earlier, on a cold evening in our American home. The children were asleep upstairs. My husband and I had been arguing about something small, but small problems can become surprisingly talented at collecting bigger problems. I had made a mistake in English during dinner. My husband corrected me without thinking. I became quiet. He asked what was wrong. I said, "Nothing." He asked again. I said, "I'm tired." He believed me. That was the problem. I was not tired. I was hurt. But instead of saying, "That embarrassed me," I shut down. My husband went to the bedroom. I stayed in the kitchen. 10 minutes became 20. Then 30. Finally, he came downstairs with his jacket in his hand. "I need some air," he said. I looked at him and felt panic. But instead of asking him to stay, I said the worst possible sentence, "Do whatever you want." He stared at me. "Do you really mean that?" I was terrified. "Yes." He picked up his keys. The door closed. And the moment it did, I broke down. I called my mother-in-law. She came over. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, crying so hard that even simple English disappeared. She asked, "What do you want?" I said, "I want him to stay." She asked, "Then why did you tell him to leave?" I had no answer. Finally, I whispered, "Because I was afraid." She opened her notebook that night and wrote down my sentence. "I am afraid my husband will stop loving me if I am not good enough." She did not show me the notebook then. She simply sat beside me. When my husband returned, she left the room. He stood near the doorway. I wanted to explain everything, but my brain was full of tangled English. So I remembered what she had taught me. Slow down. Use simple words. Tell the truth. I looked at him and said, I was hurt. He waited. I was embarrassed. He kept listening. And I was afraid you would think I was stupid. His face softened. Then I said the hardest sentence, "I need you to love me even when my English is not perfect." My husband walked toward me. He did not give a speech. He simply hugged me. That moment taught me something language textbooks rarely explain. Sometimes the most powerful English sentence is not the most advanced one. It is the sentence you finally have the courage to say. I began using a simple practice after that. Whenever I felt overwhelmed, I stopped and built one clear sentence. I feel hurt. I need help. Please listen. I need more time. I love you. These sentences became emotional tools. I could use them even when my vocabulary disappeared. My mother-in-law later told me that this was why she had been so patient with me. She did not want me to sound like a native speaker. She wanted me to stop believing that I had to sound perfect to deserve respect. That changed the way I practiced English. Instead of memorizing huge lists of vocabulary, I focused on useful phrases I could actually use with my husband and children. I listened to slow English stories while making breakfast. I repeated short sentences aloud. I paused when I needed to. I listened again. The goal was not perfection. The goal was connection. And strangely, the more relaxed I became, the more English I understood. My husband noticed it too. One morning, he said, "You sound more confident." I laughed. "I still make mistakes." He answered, "So do I." That became our little joke. But there was still something I did not know. Why had my mother-in-law kept that notebook for so long? Why had she written down my private words? I asked her. She looked away for a moment. Then she said, "Because I wanted you to see something one day." "What?" I asked. She opened the notebook again and turned to the final page. There was only one sentence written there. My name was above it. And underneath, in her handwriting, were 6 words that made my stomach drop. "Your husband told me to leave." The secret I never knew. What if the person you trusted most had once asked your mother-in-law to leave your marriage alone? I thought those words meant my husband wanted to escape from our family. For a few terrible seconds, I believed he had secretly blamed me for everything, including my English, my mistakes, and the distance growing between us. But when my mother-in-law finally explained the truth, I discovered something completely different. The sentence in her notebook was not the end of my marriage. It was the beginning of the moment my husband realized he had to change. I looked at her and asked, "Why did he tell you to leave?" She took a deep breath. "Because he thought I was making things worse." I was shocked. "You?" She nodded. Then she told me what had happened after that difficult night. My husband had been angry, but not only with me. He was angry with himself. He believed he was helping me whenever he corrected my English. He thought that if he fixed my mistakes quickly, I would improve faster. He did not understand that every correction made me more nervous. Every interruption made me speak less. Every unfinished sentence made me wonder if my voice was becoming a problem inside my own family. My mother-in-law had noticed this. She told him, "She does not need another person correcting her. She needs someone willing to listen." My husband apparently did not like hearing that. He told her to stop interfering. Then he said something that surprised me even more. "I need you to leave her alone." My mother-in-law looked at me. "I did not leave you alone," she said. "I simply stopped teaching you the way I thought you needed." Instead, she started listening. That was the real lesson. When I spoke English, she did not immediately correct every grammar mistake. She waited for meaning. If I used the wrong word but she understood me, she kept the conversation going. If she truly did not understand, she asked, "Can you say that another way?" That question changed my confidence. It taught me that communication is not a grammar exam. It is a bridge. Sometimes the bridge is beautiful. Sometimes it has a few missing boards. You still cross it. I started using this idea in my English practice. If I heard a sentence I did not understand, I stopped trying to translate every single word. Instead, I listened for the main idea. Who is speaking? What happened? How does the person feel? What does the person want? Then I listened again. This simple habit made slow English listening feel less stressful. I did not need to catch everything. I needed to catch enough to understand the story. My mother-in-law also taught me something about American family culture that I had misunderstood. In her family, people often spoke directly about feelings. At first, I thought direct English sounded rude. She explained that saying, "I need some space," did not necessarily mean, "I do not love you." Saying, "I disagree," did not mean, "I reject you." And saying, "I need help," did not mean, "I am weak." These were simply clear ways of communicating. I began practicing those phrases at home. I need a minute. I understand your point. I see it differently. Can we talk about this later? Simple English. Real life. Less drama. My marriage slowly changed because of those small sentences. My husband began waiting for me to finish. I began telling him what I actually felt instead of expecting him to guess. We still argued. Of course we did. We were married, not two peaceful clouds floating above a yoga studio. But our arguments became different. We started repairing problems sooner. One evening, my husband sat beside me and said, "My mom was right." I laughed. "Please never tell her that. She will remember it forever." He laughed too. Then his expression became serious. "I was correcting your English because I was afraid people would judge you." I looked at him. "And what did you think I needed?" He answered, "Protection." That word made me quiet. Suddenly, I understood something about love. Sometimes people try to protect us in ways that actually make us feel smaller. My husband had not wanted to hurt me. He had been afraid that other people would misunderstand my English. But his fear had made me afraid to speak. My mother-in-law had seen it before either of us did. Then she gave me the final page of her notebook. I expected another sentence about English. Instead, I saw a date. It was the date of our wedding anniversary. Under it was one short message: "Tonight, he finally told me the truth about why he married you." I looked at my mother-in-law. My heart started beating faster. What truth? She closed the notebook and whispered, "You should ask your husband yourself. Why he really married me. What if the person you loved had chosen you for a reason you never believed you were worthy of?" I stood in my mother-in-law's kitchen, staring at the date written in her notebook. It was our wedding anniversary. Underneath it were the words, "Tonight, he finally told me the truth about why he married you." My heart raced. For years, I had secretly wondered whether my husband regretted marrying me because my English was not perfect. Maybe he wanted someone more confident. Maybe he was tired of repeating things. Maybe one day, he would decide that love was easier with someone who never needed extra time to understand. Those thoughts had lived quietly inside me, like unwanted guests who somehow knew where I kept the snacks. I called my husband. "Can we talk?" He looked at my face and immediately knew something was wrong. What happened? I placed the notebook on the table. His expression changed. Where did you get that? Your mom gave it to me. He closed his eyes for a second. I hoped she would never show you that. My heart dropped. Why? He sat beside me. Because I was embarrassed. I waited. He took my hand. Not because of your English. Because I was afraid you would discover how insecure I was. I almost laughed. This was not the answer I expected. He explained that before we married, he had noticed something about me that had nothing to do with language. He said I listened carefully. I remembered small things. I asked questions. I noticed when someone was uncomfortable. I cared about people even when I was tired. He said those qualities mattered more to him than perfect words. But why did you correct my English so much? I asked. He looked down. Because I thought I was helping you become confident. I did not realize I was making you feel less confident. That sentence hit me deeply. Sometimes love can be sincere and still be clumsy. Someone can have good intentions and still cause pain. My husband continued. When we first met, you made mistakes in English. You also laughed at yourself. You never pretended to know everything. I loved that. I stared at him. You loved my mistakes? He smiled. Not exactly. I loved that you were not afraid of being human. I felt tears forming. My mother-in-law had been right. Patience was not just about waiting for my English. It was about allowing me to become myself without constantly measuring me against someone else. I asked my husband what he had told his mother that night years ago. He answered, I told her I was scared. Scared of what? That you would stop talking to me. I froze. He explained that when I became quiet, he thought I was emotionally leaving the marriage. He did not understand that sometimes I was simply searching for words. My silence had been mistaken for distance. His corrections had been mistaken for rejection. We had both been translating each other badly. Not from one language to another, but from one heart to another. That realization changed the way I saw communication. In English practice, we often focus on vocabulary, pronunciation, grammar, and listening speed. Those things matter. But communication also requires patience. If you miss a sentence, ask again. If you do not understand a feeling, ask gently. If you make a mistake, repair it instead of hiding. I began using one phrase more often than any other. Let me make sure I understand you. It became useful with my husband, my children, and even during everyday conversations in America. It gave me time to listen instead of reacting. My mother-in-law called it the patience sentence. I called it my emergency button. The more I used it, the fewer arguments we had. Not because we became perfect, but because we stopped assuming we already knew what the other person meant. Later that evening, my husband opened an old box from our wedding day. Inside was a photograph of the two of us. On the back, he had written something I had never seen. I read it slowly. I hope she always knows she never has to become someone else for me. I could barely breathe. I looked at him and whispered, "You wrote this?" He nodded. Before we got married. I cried. He hugged me. And for the first time, I understood something that had taken me years to learn. My English had never been the measure of my worth. My voice mattered because it was mine. But just when I thought the biggest secret was finally over, my mother-in-law walked into the room holding another envelope. She looked at both of us and said, "There is one more thing you need to know about your wedding day." She handed the envelope to me. My name was written across the front. I opened it, and inside was a letter from someone I never expected to hear from again. The letter I never expected. What if one letter could make you question everything you thought you knew about your own wedding day? I held the envelope in my hands and stared at my name. The handwriting looked familiar, but I could not place it. My husband looked at the envelope and suddenly became very quiet. That scared me more than the letter itself. "Who is it from?" I asked. He did not answer. My mother-in-law stood behind us with tears in her eyes. "Open it," she whispered. I slowly pulled out the paper. The first sentence made my heart stop. "I hope you are still learning to trust your own voice." I knew immediately who had written it. It was from an old friend of mine who had known me during one of the hardest periods of my life. I had not spoken to her in years. She had been at my wedding, but she had left early. I had always wondered why. As I continued reading, the pieces began to connect. She wrote that before my wedding, she had noticed how nervous I was about speaking English around my husband's family. She remembered me practicing simple sentences alone in a bathroom mirror. She remembered me asking, "What if they think I am not good enough?" At the time, she had told me something I had forgotten. The right people will listen for your meaning, not count your mistakes. I stopped reading. My eyes filled with tears. My mother-in-law gently said, "She gave me this letter after your wedding." I looked at her. "Why didn't you give it to me then?" She smiled sadly. "Because you were not ready." That sentence annoyed me. How could you know when I was ready? She looked directly at me. I didn't. I waited. There it was again. Patience. The word that had followed me through every difficult moment. I had thought patience meant sitting still and waiting for life to improve. But my mother-in-law had shown me another meaning. Patience can be active. You can listen. You can observe. You can support someone without forcing them to change before they are ready. That idea also changed my English learning. I had spent years rushing. I wanted to understand fast American English immediately. I wanted to speak without pauses. I wanted every sentence to sound natural. But real progress was quieter. I started listening to slow English first, then slightly faster conversations. I repeated short phrases instead of trying to memorize entire pages. I read aloud until my mouth became comfortable with the rhythm. Most importantly, I stopped punishing myself for forgetting. If I forgot a word, I described it another way. If I missed a sentence, I asked someone to repeat it. If my pronunciation was imperfect, I kept going. I learned that fluency is not the absence of mistakes. It is the ability to continue after a mistake. That lesson became especially important with my children. One evening, my son asked me to help him with homework. I made a pronunciation mistake while reading one sentence. He corrected me. For 1 second, I felt the old embarrassment. Then I laughed. Good catch. He smiled. Mom, you are getting better. I looked at him and realized something beautiful. My children were not watching a perfect English speaker. They were watching a mother who refused to quit. That mattered more. Later that night, I asked my husband why he had never shown me the letter. He said, because my mom asked me to wait. I looked toward the kitchen. She told you? He nodded. She said you were spending too much time trying to prove that you belonged in our family. She wanted you to understand that you never had to prove it. I could not speak. My husband continued. She told me that if I really loved you, I needed to stop trying to make you less afraid and start making you feel safe. My mother-in-law heard him from the other room. She walked in and said, I was learning too. That surprised me. Learning what? I asked. She smiled. How to be your mother-in-law without becoming your judge. We all laughed. It was probably the most honest sentence anyone had said in our family. She admitted that she had sometimes been too direct. I admitted that I sometimes heard criticism where there was only concern. My husband admitted that he often tried to solve problems before understanding them. We were not suddenly perfect. But we were finally honest. That night, I put the letter beside my English notebook. On the next page, I wrote one sentence, patience is love when love chooses to stay. I read it slowly. Then I read it again. I wanted to remember it. Years earlier, I had believed that speaking perfect English would make me confident. Now I understood the opposite. Confidence had given me the courage to keep speaking imperfect English. And that courage had changed my marriage, my relationship with my mother-in-law, and the way my children saw me. I thought the story was finally complete. I was wrong. The next morning, my mother-in-law called me before breakfast. Her voice sounded different. Come over alone, she said. There is something I have never told your husband. I froze. What is it? She paused. Then she whispered, it is the real reason I started teaching you English. Patience is love. What if the person who taught you English was never really trying to teach you English at all? I arrived at my mother-in-law's house that morning with one question in my mind. Why did you start teaching me? She looked at me for a long moment, then smiled and said, because I saw you disappearing. I did not understand. She explained that years earlier, she had watched me become quieter at family gatherings. I stopped telling stories. I stopped joining conversations. I smiled when I wanted to speak, then stayed silent because I was afraid of making a mistake. She said, your English was not disappearing. Your confidence was. That sentence broke something open inside me. She told me that after our wedding, she had noticed how carefully I watched everyone's faces whenever I spoke. I was not only listening to English. I was listening for judgment. So she decided to help me in a different way. She did not want to teach me complicated grammar. She wanted to give me a safe place to speak. That was why she asked me about coffee, breakfast, the weather, my children, my husband, and ordinary American life. She wanted me to practice English where mistakes were allowed. She wanted me to discover that a wrong word did not make me a wrong person. I started crying. Why didn't you tell me this before? I asked. She smiled. Because sometimes people understand a lesson only after they are ready to hear it. There was that word again, patience. I finally understood why she had repeated it so many times. Patience was not weakness. It was not waiting helplessly. It was love giving another person room to grow. I thought about my husband. He had learned to stop correcting every sentence. I had learned to stop hiding every mistake. Our conversations became slower, but somehow our relationship became stronger. We began asking simple questions. Are you okay? What do you need? Did I understand you correctly? Do you want advice, or do you just want me to listen? Those sentences became part of our family language. They also became excellent English practice. I learned that real English is not always about impressive vocabulary. Sometimes the most useful English is the language of everyday emotions. I'm worried. I'm tired. I need help. I disagree. I'm sorry. I forgive you. I love you. These are simple sentences, but they can carry an entire life. My mother-in-law told me something else that morning. She said, never confuse slow progress with no progress. I wrote it down. That sentence became one of my favorite reminders whenever English felt difficult. If you are learning English and sometimes feel frustrated, remember my story. You may listen to a sentence today and understand only half of it. That does not mean you failed. Listen again tomorrow. Read it aloud. Repeat one phrase. Use it in a real conversation. Your brain needs repeated contact with language before unfamiliar sounds begin to feel familiar. You do not have to become perfect overnight. You only have to keep showing up. I started doing exactly that. Every morning, I listened to slow English for a few minutes. I read short passages aloud. I repeated natural American English phrases. Then I used one new sentence during the day. Sometimes I made mistakes. Sometimes my children laughed, not cruelly, but because I said something funny. And sometimes I laughed at myself first. That was freedom. English stopped being a test I had to pass. It became a tool I could use to connect with people I loved. Months later, we had another family dinner. My husband was talking. My children were laughing. My mother-in-law was telling one of her long stories that somehow always became longer than expected. I interrupted her gently and said, "Mom, slow down. I want to understand every word." Everyone laughed. She looked at me and smiled. "Now you sound confident." I smiled back. "Not perfect." She shook her head. I never asked for perfect. That sentence stayed with me. I looked at my husband. He reached for my hand under the table. My children were arguing about dessert. The house was noisy, warm, and completely ordinary. And somehow, that ordinary moment felt like the happiest ending I could have received. I had once believed that better English would make me more worthy. Now I knew better. My English did not create my place in this family. Love did. Patience did. Listening did. And courage did. My mother-in-law did not give me a perfect English voice. She helped me find my own. My husband did not need me to sound like a native speaker. He needed me to tell him what was in my heart. My children did not need a perfect mother. They needed a mother who kept trying. And I did not need to become someone else. I only needed to stop being afraid of being myself. So if you are listening to this story while learning English, remember one sentence: patience is love when love chooses to stay. Stay patient with your English. Stay patient with your family. And, perhaps most importantly, stay patient with yourself. Because sometimes the person who speaks slowly is not falling behind. Sometimes she is finally learning to speak from the heart.